My name is Ed Pereira. I'm on the organizing committee of BC Aware. I'm also past president for ISACA Vancouver. And I am extremely privileged and proud to introduce to you the Privacy Commissioner of BC, and Michael McEvoy and the office that he's a part of, which is the Office of Information and Privacy, has been an integral part of BC Aware campaign, believe it or not, since the very beginning. In fact, even the year before BC Aware started, we had the BC Privacy and Security Awareness Day, and that was kind of the sort of the birth of BC Aware. The following year, the same group came together and started up BC Aware, and each and every year, either Michael and or his predecessor, Elizabeth Denham, has been at each of our events or has spoken at our events, and we're extremely grateful to have them as part of the BC Aware campaign. So without further ado, come on up, Michael.
So 1 year ago, I found myself across the Atlantic Ocean in the United Kingdom, helping out the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK with a major investigation that they were undertaking. And almost precisely to the day, looking at my calendar from last year, I was in a hotel room in Brussels preparing a speech I was to give the next day at a major conference on computers and privacy protection in the European capital. What transpired next was a phone call that morning that I received telling me that a key witness, a witness that we had been trying for months to locate and interview with respect to the investigation I was involved in, that witness, and this was through an intermediary, said that witness would now be available to talk. That was great, I said. When would that be? This afternoon, the person told me. This person was in London. I don't know how many of you have been on this thing. That's I had not. That's the Eurostar that takes you from Brussels to London in about 2 hours. So I got on that in a hell of a hurry because we knew this was actually quite critical to the work we were doing in the investigation. And I found myself in a lawyer's office in London, downtown, right in downtown, with a colleague of mine. You may recognize this woman. That's Elizabeth Denham, who is formerly Commissioner for Information and Privacy in British Columbia, and now the Commissioner in the UK. We found ourselves in a room with our key witness and the key witness's lawyer, who had several concerns, which I'll talk about in a moment. In fact, I'll return to that meeting in just a moment and what happened, because it had profound implications for global events and what later became the Cambridge Analytica Facebook story. So it was probably a year and a half ago. I was serving as Deputy Commissioner for Information and Privacy in British Columbia, and interested in the job, which I now serve in, when I got a phone call from my old colleague, Elizabeth, who said that she was undertaking an investigation into political parties in the United Kingdom. She described it as probably the most significant investigation that she has and would ever likely undertake. It had been a couple of months in the making, and would I come to the UK to lead the investigation? I was somewhat, I'm not sure, I was a little shocked actually at first. You have 600 people working for you in your office in the UK. Surely there would be somebody that could take it on, and she persuaded me that I ought to come over and do this. So my wife and I, sitting on our lovely deck in August, decided to pull up and head to this place, Wilmslow, 53.5 degrees latitude. It actually is southern part of Manchester. This is a place, a population of about 25,000. A lot of, for any football fans out there, a lot of footballers from Man City and Man U live in this location. We would see them frequently on weekends. So I went to work in the office. What had got Liz initially interested, and more than interested, there was a public concern around how political parties, political organizations were collecting and using data. And what kind of got that started was a series of articles in the Observer newspaper and the Guardian, particularly by a woman by the name of Carol Cadwallader, who wrote about Brexit and how data was used. And this was actually one of the key articles that she wrote, and she wrote a series of them, but she eventually got, I think, the George Orwell Prize for Journalism as a result of this. But it certainly tweaked Liz's interest about how data was being used. And so the focus of the investigation, at least initially, was on how political parties in the United Kingdom collect and use information about voters. It was, to say the least, an interesting experience for me. I don't know how many of you out there are political science students or interested in that world, which I certainly was just generally. To be sitting in a room with all of the key operatives from all of the major parties in the United Kingdom, questioning them about how they collect, use, disclose data, how their analytic process works around their data in order to sort of fill out the terms of our undertaking in this investigation. It was really interesting, some of the things we did find out. One of the things that comes to mind when we were interviewing the Labour Party, do you use data brokers? And most of the parties did. So they had your name on the voters list, and they would meld it with all kinds of other things they would find out about you. One of the things they told us they used was something called Emma's List. So Emma's List, it turns out, is a list of individuals who are signed up. These are women mostly, women and families, in maternity wards in hospitals throughout the United Kingdom. So you can just imagine if you're just in the process of giving birth or have given birth or maybe on an epidural, some person comes around, and this is all was endorsed by the physicians in the UK, would come around and visit you and ask you if you were interested in all kinds of free things and products. All you had to do was give your information to them. A lot of people did that. The Labour Party, because they were interested in targeting some of these women because they thought they had something in their platform that would be attractive, bought this list from Emma's List. One of the problems with Emma's List when they went around collecting in terms of describing to people whose names were being given over was they didn't actually tell the individuals how their names and information would be used. Nobody told them they were going to hand their information over to a political party. That was, that's kind of just one example of the kind of data that was used in the analytics that parties were using, all of which would be put together essentially to, and all the parties did this, create a score about the individual voter, their propensity, their likelihood to support or vote for that party. I'll come back to Emma's List in a second, what the result of that was at the end of the day. As we got into the story, it was actually Carol Cadwallader from The Guardian who said to me, you know, there's a guy you really want to talk to about some of this stuff, about the data collection and whatever, who can give you real insight into it. That's the person I was talking about that I tried to track down for some period of time. And his lawyer called me at one point and said her client would be okay to speak with us and disclose a lot of things that we would find of interest. The first thing, and this is something it won't surprise you, as a regulator, these are sometimes tough calls because lawyers phone you and tell you they've got a client who has an interesting story to tell. Will my client be in jeopardy? Will they be charged with something? And so you have to make a judgment in these cases. Is the story of greater interest essentially than would be the interest in prosecuting somebody and so In this case, we determined that actually what was really important in the public interest was to hear the story of this individual. So that's what happened. I got on the train from Brussels and I met up with Liz in London, in the lawyer's office. I don't know if you recognize this character. This is Chris Wiley. I think his hair was actually blue when we interviewed him the first time. I can't tell you, by the way, the irony of this situation. Liz, who's from Victoria, BC, she has a home there. Me from Victoria, BC, based there, sitting in a lawyer's room in London with Chris Wiley, who happens to be from Victoria, BC. So all of us with these funny accents, surrounded by these folks from in the legal, some great legal minds in the UK. And so we start to interview Chris about what he knows. So it turns out Chris was connected with, those are the words I'll use, a company called Cambridge Analytica. They undertook lots of political projects, gathering data, targeting data. Turns out Chris was involved with facilitating Facebook data that was being melded with survey data that was being done. I don't know if the name Alexander Kogan rings a bell. So Kogan was a fellow, he was a professor at Cambridge University. The essence of it was, just to shorthand it, is that essentially they were sucking down millions of Facebook user data information. It was in the old days with Facebook's permissions, what actually happened was that there were individuals who actually went on and voluntarily took a survey, and they voluntarily give away their Facebook information. They unlock the keys. What happened was, though, as a result of that, Kogan and Cambridge and these guys could not just get those people who volunteered their data, they got all of their friends. So you can imagine with surveying a couple 100,000 people with their hundreds of friends, suddenly the number morphs into, I think 50 million, including, by the way, 660,000 Canadians were involved in all of that. Chris was telling this incredible story of all of these things. Goings on in, that Cambridge was involved in Nigeria, Trinidad and Tobago. It was, and the stories were incredible. I mean, incredible corruption and targeting and all kinds of things. And we said, well, we have to carry this conversation on, and it would lead to several more meetings. But I had to go back to Brussels to make the speech the next day. And just before leaving, I will not forget this. He said, and sorry, did I forget to tell you about the Russians? And no, I say that, I don't say that actually flippantly, because there is a significant connection. It turns out, in fact, Kogan had gone to St. Petersburg. There are open questions now about how that data was used and whether it went other places just besides the US election, and we can talk about that in a second. But I ended up going back to Brussels that night, and I have to tell you, in the tube, looking over my shoulder, looking for guys with umbrellas with pointy tips, plutonium tips or whatever. It was a little creepy. But the story went on. It took us to further investigation, obviously, and particularly into Cambridge Analytica. I don't know if any of you saw this. Channel 4, which is a big news station in the UK, did an expose on Cambridge Analytica, where they had an undercover reporter. The reporter was posing as a politician somewhere, I can't remember, it was in the Middle East or something, and he was looking for Cambridge Analytica help him out. Like, what services did Cambridge Analytica offer? And Alexander Nix, who is the CEO of Cambridge, undercover at a restaurant, reveals that, in fact, there's all kinds of services they could offer, from hacking computers to sending prostitutes to people's doors and so on. I mean, it was incredible. Anyways, we saw a preview of this about 30 minutes before Liz Denham was to go on the air to be interviewed by the chief news correspondent for Channel 4 to get her reaction to all of this, which she did. Of course, she indicated her outrage. This is actually a picture from that interview on Channel 4. And what had transpired up just before this point, we put in the wheels in motion to get a warrant to get into Cambridge Analytica's headquarters. Now, the way the system worked under the Data Protection Act in the UK, it was crazy, basically, because we had to sort of we had to publicly disclose all the facts around seeking the warrant. You can imagine that would take out a little element of surprise in all of that. But there we were trying to get the warrant, and that was publicly, actually wasn't that publicly known. Certainly Cambridge knew it, and other players. Liz on TV told the announcer that that's what we were doing. The news announcer said to her, "Oh, that's really interesting," he says, "because we have just learned, like literally at this very moment, that Facebook is actually in Cambridge Analytica's headquarters right now, and they intend to do an audit of Cambridge's operation." This was probably just seconds before the guy said this to Liz, and you could literally see her face on TV going red from the neck up, and she just said, "We are the regulator." And shortly after that interview, I, along with one of Liz's deputies, got on the phone with Facebook and told them, and I'll use polite terms, to get out of Cambridge's office. They were clearly implicated, potentially implicated, for data crimes, if I can put it that way, along with Cambridge Analytica, and they had no business going in there and disturbing evidence and so on, especially when everybody knew we were in the process of attempting to get a warrant. So, and Facebook backed off instantly. Whether it was ignorance on their part, I don't think so. I came to learn in my dealings with them there and here that it wouldn't surprise you to know that there's a certain amount of, I'll use the word arrogance on the part of the company, and belief that I suppose what they were doing was right, but it was clearly not right and not appropriate. So funnily enough, I was actually on TV. The journalists were covering the warrant application. The judge had said he was prepared to stay all night and listen to it. The reporter on TV, a couple of BBC, and I think it was on BBC, said, "Oh, well, they've just understood the judge will be listening all night, and we may." And then it's one of these moments where the guy says, "Oh, wait a second. No, we just have word now that that yes, the judge has granted the warrant." We had determined right at that moment, if the judge granted the warrant, this was on a Friday afternoon, we were going to go in right away, and we had the crew, and they were great, really interesting, great team, go in right away, and I have to say it was very, very interesting for me because the team was incredible. There were people who had been in Scotland Yard and all this stuff, so they had done all the work. They'd cased the place out, just like you'd see on, CSI or something. Cased the whole place out, determined all the entrances and exits and all that sort of stuff. So they were well prepared. Went into the offices. And it ended up, the judge's announcement, the commentator, and an hour later when came back to the news guys to wrap up the news, our guys were going in. The warrant had been granted. Our guys were going in. And these were the pictures that were grabbed. This was in The Guardian, but the TV cameras had picked this up. I can tell you that this picture went out worldwide. My colleagues, regulator colleagues around the world, just thought this was the coolest thing. Where did you get those jackets? That is just unbelievable. So it was quite. So they were actually in there 12 hours, something like that, until like 4 o'clock in the morning and Saturday morning, gathering up evidence. Now, despite sometimes things are surprising. Despite the time and advance notice that was had, there were a lot of things seized. So servers, computers, telephones, all kinds of things. I can't get too much into the detail of it, but what I can say, I think there was the evidence actually is still being gone over now. There were something like 7 terabytes of information, 52 million pages of documents. So the forensic work is, like as you can imagine, it's absolutely phenomenally challenging and difficult, but that's still going on as we speak. The other thing that emerged out of this, and I commend it to you, several publications. I should also say, by the way, somewhere in all of this, I, along with the team, had worked really, really hard to get Facebook in a room to sit down to answer some of the allegations and things that we had learned. It was not that easy to do, I have to say, and we were on the point of just ordering them to appear in front of us. But we did finally arrange for, and I remember this, February the 8th, so just a little under, a little over a year ago. And so just as we got that nailed down, I got a phone call from Kate Ryan Lloyd, who's the clerk of committees in British Columbia Legislature, who said to me, the committee for the commissioner's job in BC would like to interview you. I said, that's great. When would they like to do that? February the 8th. I said, Kate, I really want the job, but I said, we've gone to the ends of the earth to get this thing done, and this interview, and I can't do that. So the committee was very kind and very gracious and gave me a couple of extra days to get myself together and fly over. Obviously, I was very honored to take the position on that I have now. The one disappointing part of it is I had started into helping write the documents which eventually appear, and the team was incredible. So disappointed not to be able to complete that work, but I would commend all of these publications to you because they really speak. It's not just about the UK, it's about how political parties globally look and collect information. Just sort of the kind of the postscript. Facebook was fined £500,000 as a result of the Cambridge Analytica thing. That's not a lot of money in the whole scheme of things for Facebook. That they probably make that much profit in a day. But that was the maximum that Liz could fine them under the old Data Protection Act. The new General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, many of you have probably heard of that, allows for much heavier fines, 4% of global turnover, up to about 20 million euros. And so, you may have heard of a recent fine on Google, I think it was 50 million euros. So this is a much more significant penalty-making structure that has put in place in Europe. It didn't exist at the time this investigation was undertaking. I mentioned Emma's Diary, the folks collecting information in hospitals. They were fined as a result of this investigation, £140,000, not an insignificant amount for a smaller scale operation, but clearly a signal had to be sent about how people's data is collected without authority, and why that is obviously not just, it's both ethically and was against the law. So those profound issues that were raised in the political campaigning context really, I think, have caused a lot of us as regulators globally to reflect on that, especially when we think about our democracy and its importance. What political parties do to profile you, to make a determination about whether you're support or not. It's important that parties have the right to communicate with all of us, but it's also got to be the case that parties have to explain to voters how they're using their data. So based on this, our office decided that we wanted to undertake an investigation into how political parties in British Columbia use your data. This, it turns out, is interesting from one perspective, which is that we are the only jurisdiction in Canada that allows for this. All other privacy commissioners, including the one in Ottawa, interestingly enough, the legislators have exempted themselves from privacy regulation. People ask me, why is it different in BC? Was it a mistake? Was it an accident? Was it an oversight? I actually don't know the answer to that question. But in any event, we're in the fortunate position, I think the public should feel that they're in the fortunate position of at least allowing for some oversight into that process. So right now, I would say I'm just in the very final phases of wrapping up that investigation. I expect there may be something public in that regard in the next couple of weeks, so you should stay tuned. I don't want to do too many spoiler alerts, but it's not Cambridge Analytica happening here, which is good, and we didn't expect that. But I think there will be some surprises in there about what parties do. And I'd like to think of it as a bit of a chance for pause and reflection. There is no question, and talking to an audience who's very knowledgeable about these things, that the tools that are increasingly being used, the analytic tools, are becoming much more sophisticated. The ability to micro-target is becoming much more sophisticated. It would not be at all surprising for political parties to want to gain some advantage, insight into all of you, and to make predictions about all of you. And so the thing is, how do we draw boundaries around this? Because there have to be boundaries and borders drawn around it. And so I think the investigation report that I will be issuing shortly is sort of a call for that sort of pause and a discussion amongst the public, the political parties, and everybody else about how data should be used, what's appropriate, and whether parties, what they're doing now, has gone over the line or not. So again, I would ask you to keep an eye out for that. Also on the privacy side, there are, depending on the numbers, it seems to vary from time to time, but we regulate on the private sector side, so that includes everything from charities, businesses, trade unions, whatever, well over 500,000 entities in British Columbia, subject to PIPA, Personal Information Protection Act. There's a lot of businesses that don't even know that. There's a lot of businesses that may know that there's a law out there but aren't quite sure how it applies. And one of the key things that I would like to do as Commissioner is to do a better job of educating the private sector in particular about what their legal roles and responsibilities are. And so working with a really great team of communications folks in our office, we're going to do something called PrivacyRight and probably roll that out in the next couple of months, which is, it'll be a series of things you'll see on our webpage, webinars, videos, materials that will help businesses, charities, unions, all kinds of private sector organizations understand their roles and responsibility to ensure that they have the public's trust when they're handling their personal information. It's pretty hard now to even go a day without hearing some story in the media about a data breach. And so this is much more in the public consciousness. Cambridge Analytica Facebook story, and sometimes I just had to, there I was in the middle of this investigation and turning on the news and listening to this stuff and really feeling like this was a seismic event globally about privacy. People might ask, I think a lot of people asked, well, I'm on Facebook, sure, privacy or whatever, and I'm just exchanging information with friends. What could go wrong with that? And I think what happened with the Cambridge Analytica story is people saw, sometimes for the first time, what could go very wrong with that. Their data being used, the essence of which was to psychologically profile voters. That was the essence of it. And then use that data, exploit it to micro-target to people who might be susceptible to particular messages. For those of you who didn't follow it, the profiling happened on a thing called, there's lots of these scales, but in this case it was the OCEAN scale was used. OCEAN, O standing for openness, conscientiousness for C, across the board till you get to N, which is neuroticism. And this is probably a little more sophisticated. It's a little more sophisticated than just the word, but a fairly sophisticated way of psychologically profiling people. And once put in the box, figuring out the best way to message people. That, I think, shocked a lot of folks. And there's no, and so this was used by the Trump organization in the United States. And there is a question, there's a serious question around whether, in fact, the Russians actually had access to some of this stuff, because they clearly had the tools and the sophistication to be able to facilitate some of the targeting. I guess we'll find out when Mueller's report comes out eventually. So that was, I think, just one of the most significant events on the privacy front, I think, in the last number of years, and something that is leading to, I think, reform across the globe. In British Columbia, I can say that we have some ways to go. Our act has been in place since 2004, but changes need to be made to it. There's no question about it. Breach notification, So a company breaches your information, they have no legal obligation in British Columbia to report that to me. More importantly, they have no obligation to report it to you, even if it's harmful. Now, as a matter of course, we will get breach reports to our office. People will voluntarily make them, particularly the big players. But it seems, frankly, ludicrous in this day and age that companies are not compelled to disclose that information to regulators and, again, most importantly, to the public. So we've called on that for that reform along with others. This is not in the privacy world, but I can't let this go without mention, just because I'm in front of a public audience. I don't know if anybody's following what's been going on at the Legislative Building in the last while with expenses and so on. I'm often introduced these days as the Privacy Commissioner for British Columbia, and then people forget I'm also the Access to Information Commissioner as well. There's these headlines that appear in the paper quite frequently now when there's a story around me describing me as the privacy czar. My kids just have, I'm not sure what a czar is, and I explained it's this thing in 1915 in Russia. I'm not one of those people. But access to information is a key piece of what I do. It is incredible that access to information laws do not apply to the Legislative Assembly and the work that is done there. So the first Commissioner of Information and Privacy in British Columbia, David Flaherty, so we're going back to 1993, said the law should apply to the Assembly, and others have said it since, and I am saying it again. The whole purpose of those laws is about transparency and ensuring that governments, in this case our provincial government, and the people who work in the Assembly are held to account. That's what it's about. So not everything will be disclosable. There are certain legislative privileges. But when it comes to very basic things like expenses and financial accounting, that all must be transparent, just like it is for 2,900 other public bodies. There has been an argument made in the past about the uniqueness of the institution. There's probably some element of truth. There's some uniqueness about it. Not unique to the point where they should be away from the sunlight of transparency that is absolutely critical for functioning. So the Premier has recently made statements that they're looking at access to information being applied to the Assembly and to legislators. I hope that the entire Legislative Assembly will be of that view when they reconstitute themselves in a few weeks, because it's absolutely imperative, if for nothing more than public trust in our institutions. Because although sometimes, and I don't make a judgment about what's going on, and who knows what's going to result from all of that, but I think for a lot of members of the public, they look at this and they go, it's all like the public service. This is just like the whole thing, people at the trough, which is not at all what it is. It's just tens of thousands of public servants doing incredible work on your behalf. But it just brings into disrepute, I think, the whole institution. And I think what needs to be done is they have to reconstitute that trust, and access to information is one of those key ways to do that. What else can I tell you about the office? If you don't know, we talk about all this work that we do. We have an enormous staff of 38 people covering 2,900 public bodies and over 500,000 private sector institutions. A lot of our work is what I would call, and I don't say this in a pejorative way, but it is what we're mandated to do, react. So if you've got a privacy complaint, you come to our office and we deal with that. If there's an access to information complaint, you go to a public body, they don't give you the information you want, you can come to our office and appeal that. Altogether, we maybe get about 10,000 queries that come through our door during the year. Most of these things are resolved. 95% of things are resolved without going to an inquiry or something like that. So we have an incredibly talented group of men and women who do all of that work. We have a budget of about $6 million. The other thing I need to say to you is, and this won't surprise you given the talk about Cambridge Analytica and all that, I mean, everything we do with our data, even when you go to whatever place you care to shop at, the likelihood that your data is going across borders instantaneously is almost certain. So for us as regulators to do our job, we have to be not just talking to one another, but working together internationally in order to protect your data. That's why it's British Columbia, our major trading partners are in the Asia Pacific. British Columbia, it turns out, we are the secretariat for the Asia Pacific Privacy Authorities, 20 jurisdictions across the Asia Pacific. We get together twice a year to talk about joint enforcement actions, get the latest on AI and whatever else is happening as regulators that we need to know about. And it is a challenge. As you can imagine, there are different privacy cultures across the Asia Pacific, in fact globally. There's different legal frameworks. Our challenge is to find commonality so that when a breach happens, as it did, and I'll just pick out a name, VTech, I think was the name of the company, does kids electronics, based in Hong Kong, a major breach that was a big issue. Their North American headquarters were in Richmond, BC, but they had a lot of operations in the United States. So there's conversations going on between our office, the Hong Kong regulator, Stephen Wong, and also the Federal Trade Commission in the United States. Now, Stephen doesn't have extensive powers, did have some powers to do investigatory work. I actually have a reasonable amount of investigatory powers to order disclosure of documents, to compel witnesses. What I don't have is finding power, but the Federal Trade Commission has finding power. So together, at the end of the day, VTech was held to account, and we helped in gathering some of the evidence, and it turned out that the Federal Trade Commission levied a significant fine. So as it is now, there are bilateral relationships going on related to Cambridge Analytica, interestingly enough. You talk about Liz and I and Chris Wiley, the Victorian. It turns out there's a Victoria-based company that was central in the Brexit campaign. Vote Leave, which was the major campaign in the UK, used a company called Aggregate IQ, based in, it's hard to write this stuff, Victoria, British Columbia. Vote Leave ran almost £3 million through Aggregate IQ. And so there was all kinds of questions about how the data was used, how it was financed, which wasn't our thing. That was the Elections Commission in Britain, because there were allegations that basically there was financial cheating going on, and that Aggregate IQ was kind of at the center of it. So I was, because they're in British Columbia, I do have and have authority over them, working together with our colleagues at the ICO in the UK and in Ottawa as well at the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada. So that investigation is not yet complete, and stay tuned for that as well. So those are some of the things that we're involved in. Again, I just fill out just a little bit of how the office structure works. So you've got the groups that take in the complaints, investigate the complaints, and if you don't get satisfaction there, adjudicate the complaints. And then I've got another division, the policy division, which does sort of more proactive stuff, more systemic investigations. So if we see a pattern of complaints coming in, sure, we'll investigate them individually, but sometimes it requires a more systemic response. The political party's investigation would be an example of that, where we're systemically looking at an issue and employing resources and have a really sharp team of people, but always looking for more good people, by the way, on the technical side and investigatory side. So keep your eye looking at our webpage if you're looking for career opportunities and change. The weather in Victoria is a lot better than Vancouver, I would say. So I mentioned when I left the UK, I was actually a little disappointed, obviously very grateful again to take this position on. So they had a lovely get-together for me when I left, and took me out for lunch and made up a bunch of things about how they appreciated working with me, and I say that somewhat facetiously, but it was an incredible team of people. So before they sent me off, they gave me a special presentation, which I have to say I'm grateful for, and I was quite humbled by that. It is now hanging in my office in Victoria, and once in a while at my staff's urging, I will bring it out and show it off. But anyways, that gives you a sense of a bit of an overview and lay of the land of what we do, some of the things I've been involved with, and in the last year. And so, if you've got any questions or thoughts, I'd be glad to hear them. So for those who didn't hear that, because of the GDPR now coming into force in Europe, Canada, if you're a European business doing business with Canada, European data coming to Canada, that's been okay because we are, in Canada, adequate. God, that's so mediocre sounding, isn't it? So this adequacy status, though, is super important because it then, you don't have the need for all kinds of standard contracts and whatever to transfer data. So GDPR with a much heavier emphasis on consent, the fining power, order-making power, none of which exists at the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, some of which exists in British Columbia and Alberta, but the administrative fining power doesn't exist. The answer is yes, Europe is looking at this very closely, and I have been in conversations with members of the European Commission about this when I was in Brussels actually not long ago. They are looking at it. I don't want to exaggerate and say it's the first thing on their agenda. Right now, there is a crisis in Europe with the whole Brexit thing, so they've got immediately a big fish on their plate. I mean, the UK itself, there are questions around their adequacy now, which would seem kind of ludicrous given that they've adopted the GDPR in law, but who knows, politics being what it is. But there's a serious question, and I would say it's an alarm call to legislators across this country. We have to buck up. We have to raise our standards. Europe is now the gold standard, and in order for data to flow, and I think for the public to have confidence, we need to raise our standards. So, and I think without that, there will be some serious questions about Canada's adequacy.
With respect to data using for election purposes, it looks like if the election is in America, they do the analysis in UK, and if the election is in UK, they do the analysis in Canada. Is it to get the reduced punishment or use the international lack of law enforcement so that they can get away with a small fine?
So a question about how data moves around the world to do the data analytics for political campaigning purposes, and very astutely you point out that, interestingly enough, it was the US data collected through the Cambridge Analytica thing, but the data was actually residing in the UK. So it was American data residing in the UK. And this actually was at the center of a legal action by an American academic who actually wrote to the UK commissioner and said, I want to see all the data about me that Cambridge Analytica has. So it turns out in the UK, actually like in British Columbia, you did not have to be a citizen of the UK in order to ask of your data from a UK company. Similarly, if there's a BC company that has your data and you live in Alberta or you live in Washington State, you actually have a right. You don't have to be a citizen here. So I think in that case, I don't think it was an attempt to skirt. I mean, when you think about it, if it was an attempt to skirt enforcement, it was a pretty stupid thing to do because the U.S. really has they don't have a privacy law, so to speak. They've got the Federal Trade Commission, which is based on fairness and consumer fraud. And they've kind of tried to shape and develop a jurisprudence to get at some of the privacy issues. Even now, there's a talk in the States about maybe getting a privacy law. The UK, though the penalties at the time, and I mentioned £500,000, not that significant, but still a tougher regulatory environment. So if they were trying to find a way to skirt tougher regulatory environment, probably a dumb move. And of course, my tough friend Elizabeth Denham was the wrong person to pick, I think, as an adversary. By the way, in case you didn't know, I'm just teasing her again the other day, she has become a CBE, a Commander of the British Empire, a remarkable achievement. She's been there less than 2 years, and she is going to visit Buckingham Palace on April the 4th, where Prince William will invest her in, I guess that's what they call it, investiture, as a CBE for her work, actually, in educating and doing work in the data analytic framework. It's kind of cool. Thank you.
So what are the top 3 lessons learned to highlight
top 3 lessons. God, I hate those. That sounds like clickbait counter. It's like top 5 things, top 10. Oh yeah, I'll click that. You know, the sense that from companies that this is really not the data of users. We can do what the hell we like with it. And opening up the application, as Facebook did, to people without any kind of significant controls. I mean, you can say that, well, Facebook tried to run this story that, well, you know, he violated the terms of use. It wasn't for commercial purposes. He represented, like this was Alexander Kogan, represented himself as a researcher. Who are we to know? This little company, Facebook, who doesn't really have any power to audit anything. God, shocked that our processes were being abused. But I think that comes with a certain kind of mentality that you're not treating, you kind of forget kind of where the data comes from, who you're ultimately trying to serve. Although maybe that's too naive on my part. I mean, the reality is the business model of Facebook is using, I mean, you are not the customer, so to speak. You are, you know, you're kind of who's being sold to advertisers. But that does have boundaries. That does have boundaries. So, but I think a lesson for all kinds of companies is you need to think clearly about the kind of information you have, to take stock of it, to ensure that, you know, particularly the more sensitive kinds of information, that protections are put around it, that you put in place a privacy management program. Means having somebody in your company, not just off the corner of their desk, being responsible for that, and figuring out, you know, how that information is used, how you control it, who has access to it, you know, all the basic kinds of things around privacy. So I think that story, there's so many lessons. I honestly couldn't pick out three things, but it certainly has shooken the world, and I think caused the public and companies to rethink how they approach the use of people's data. Yeah. Yes?
You mentioned data breach reporting.
Yes.
You don't have that, but under the PITA, mandatory data breach is enacted. So does it apply to these things?
Yes, that's a good question. So PIPEDA now has a data breach reporting requirements. That extends to commercial operations in provinces where the provincial governments haven't enacted privacy legislation. So, so the only provinces that have enacted actually privacy legislation in Canada are British Columbia, Alberta, and Quebec. And so everywhere else, PIPEDA breach recording requirements apply, Manitoba, Ontario, et cetera, et cetera. So we need ours updated. And then there's a question too about what the sanctions are if people are violating these things. And again, the enforcement mechanisms, to be frank, are not great at the Canadian level. Order-making power doesn't even exist for the Canadian Commissioner, which is absolutely absurd. But we... The which?
Public organizations are also.
That's right, public organizations are excluded. So it has to have a commercial bent. So that puts out like charities or whatever else. So there's a huge gap. So in a place like Ontario, there's a huge gap in what privacy legislation covers. Yeah.
Probably can't talk too much about detail on this one, but obviously Huawei's been in the news a lot lately. But I'm wondering to what extent provincial or even federal regulatory measures are starting to keep pace with some of these technological advances, whether it's in our 4G and 5G networks, and the extent to which privacy and scanning personal data is baked into the very infrastructure of
Yeah, it's a question about how privacy is baked or not into existing infrastructure around telecommunications in particular. You mentioned Huawei. So the federal commissioner would have authority over those issues. I would say that there's actually a connection between some of those issues, national security, which comes into Huawei, and what's happening on the GDPR front and adequacy. One of the concerns that the Europeans have about their citizens' data coming here is if national security operations get a hold of it, that there's no way, there's no remedy in effect for the citizen. There's no process in Canada. Like Canadians don't have much of a process either. This was a big issue with the United States. I have to say it's a little rich to some degree, because a lot of European states are very little recourse by their citizens, so they're worried about, you know, stuff coming over here and there's no recourse where there. But in any event, I digress. It's I think we probably need better mechanisms to make the national security aspect more transparent, and for us to have an insight into what they're doing. And then the state actors like the Chinese or whatever, it's interesting actually, the conferences, the meetings that we have in the Asia Pacific, we occasionally have people from mainland China there, which is really interesting. There's some interesting things going on in the private sector in China with respect to privacy that would kind of surprise me a bit, I have to say, and some actually not bad things. But of course, state surveillance is a huge issue, and a really huge issue. In fact, I don't know if many of you have heard of the social credit system that's being developed in China, which is incredible, where everything, essentially everything about you is tracked, and you get a score as a citizen, and if you get a good score, whatever that means by the state standards, that would give you access to, you know, you can go on foreign travel, you can do all kinds of things, have an advantage. Whereas if your score is lower, you won't have access to those things. It is actually quite frightening from any perspective. But the technologies are more and more sophisticated that involve looking and scanning what you're doing on your phone. You talk about telecommunications. It's pretty incredible. It's things that we do not want coming here.
Do you have any thoughts on artificial intelligence and how that impacts privacy?
Yes, artificial intelligence. I'm all for it. It's something that we as privacy regulators talk about an awful lot. How people's data is crunched for in an automated way. The most concerning thing is it's used in many instances to make decisions about individuals, judgments about individuals, predictions about individuals. Can be devastating. And when you think about, I mean, there's so many different elements and how they're, you know, be applied. One aspect would be in the legal system, for example. There's more use of, it's described as AI in helping to determine whether somebody should be let out on bail. Somebody should get out on early sentencing because of somebody's put together an AI platform which has crunched all kinds of data and come to some kind of conclusions. These have real life implications for individuals without human beings often being involved in the process. That is deeply concerning from a privacy perspective, and I think should be for all citizens. We base our legal system on reasoning and logic, and if you don't like a decision the judge has made, you can appeal it to a higher authority, the Court of Appeal. If a machine through AI makes a decision about you through one of its algorithms, how do you appeal that? You know, some of the engineers I've talked to and some brilliant people will tell you, like, they don't even know why the machine has made the decision it's made. So how do you possibly appeal it? It's like this black box. And so we have to figure out a way to bring some transparency to that black box, I think, for the sake of our citizenry. So those, yeah, I mean, AI is a huge issue and one that we think deeply about and clearly involves a regulatory framework around it. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, in BC we have the two largest credit unions headquartered here, and in, I think it was October, the largest credit union was down for about 4 or 5 days, and people couldn't get access to their accounts and finances. And they just sort of brushed it under the table and said, yeah, there was a glitch, but it's fixed. Now, it almost sounded like the cover-up. And then with the other credit union, it's been reported in the local news stations that about 20 to 30 people had their accounts hacked and money was taken out of their accounts. And the response to that was, well, you know, we're looking into it, but there was no apology by the credit union and saying, hey, we're gonna fix this. And I'm just surprised at the lack of conscience where some of these things happen, because you mentioned that data breaches don't have to be reported in British Columbia, and these financial institutions can just sort of cover them up.
Yeah, it shouldn't be just data breach reporting should not just be based on whether you know, a company in good conscience thinks it's a good thing to do. It needs to be an obligation, and what also needs to be an obligation, if there is a significant risk of harm to individuals, is you have to notify individuals. It may be that, you know, you have to get a credit check put on because it's something about your financial information, but it could also be something else. It could be information that would be embarrassing. That can often be as harmful as something financial. Our office actually helps companies and public bodies all the time to help wade through these things and help navigate through them, stopping the, you know, staunch the bleeding for starters, and then work with companies and public bodies to determine, do you need to notify people? How significant is this breach? Could people be, is there a significant risk of harm here where you have to do that? Sometimes it's not always an easy call, and of course companies, as you might imagine, are not exactly thrilled to be broadcasting this stuff because it rightly would do something to their reputations. But it is necessary in some instances, and the law should make it so. So your point is a well-taken one, and I think just emphasizes the need for mandatory breach notification.
So is there legislation on the book to try and solve that?
No, there's not at the present time. Our offices recommended it. That recommendation was adopted by a all-party committee of the legislature who said, Commissioner, you're right. The government should adopt this legislation. To date, nothing has been done about it. So we'll continue to press on that point, and with your help. It's everybody's responsibility in this room to talk to your legislators when you can about these things. You know about this stuff better than anybody, and can help to push that agenda along. It has been a delight once again to be with you. I appreciate the opportunity.